So can everybody hear me, I guess? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Carmen Maldonado, and I am hosting this Neuroscience and Society series for the Neuro-ID program. And today we have the pleasure of having in our series Dr. Mauricio Delgado, who is professor and chair of the Department of Psychology at Rutgers University-Newark. And he is the director of the Social and Affective Disorder Neuroscience Lab and the associate director of the Rutgers University Brain Imaging Center, rubric. He received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh with Dr. Julie Feist and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at NYU with Dr. Elizabeth Phelps. Dr. Delgado's research program investigates how the human brain learns from rewards and punishments, and how it uses this information to guide behavior during both simple decisions, which is learning actions that led to desired outcomes, and complex social interactions, which means learning to trust another person, and how it controls our emotion to avoid maladaptive decision-making, which is something very important for us as a social animal, and how to interact with others. So Dr. Delgado was the recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, and his research has been funded by grants from the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the National Institute of Mental Health, and the McKnight Foundation. So today, Dr. Delgado will be talking to us on a topic that is also very close to his interest, which is the topic of neuroscience and the law. So Dr. Delgado, thank you so much for being with us, and I hope everybody learns from this presentation.
All right, well, thanks very much for the lovely introduction. I really appreciate it, and thanks for the invitation. It's really nice to be here again today. And first question is, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
All right, so
Yes.
Thank you. So I've done this lecture a couple of times, and it's usually more fun if there are questions or interruptions, or if anything is not clear, just let me know, or else I'll just keep going, and that's not as much fun. But it's also a broad and basic lecture on the general ideas, whether we can even think about neuroscience and understanding the neuroscience of emotions in particular, and if that has any applications to broader society in the context of the law. And I like to start with a simple example. And this is the trial of John Hinckley Jr., who in 1981 was on trial for the attempted murder of President Reagan. And it was interesting. The reason I present this is because the defense at the case presented a CT scan or CAT scan of Hinckley's brain and suggested that, look, the brain is different. There's atrophy in parts of the brain. And perhaps the reason that this person committed a violent act is because their brain is not like other brains, right? Which the defense didn't work at that time, but it's a valid question and an interesting question for us to debate, which is, does changes in biology, specifically in the brain biology, account for changes in behavior? Sure, but can we then excuse that, or can we account for that in the brain? And then at the time, 2005, Joe Biden, who was a senator at the time, said, can we use fMRI, brain scans in particular, to determine whether a person is inclined towards criminality or violent behavior? So that's taking the extra step of saying, well, we can see if somebody's brain is different, but can we use this technology to even understand intent or criminality? Okay, and so this is, and this is during a nomination for Supreme Court Justice John Roberts. So this is something that we're going to talk about today, was this idea of whether we can detect mental states and the biology underlying it. They're going to be relevant to legal decisions. And I'm just going to present you some data, and I'm going to ask you, and hopefully you help me understand whether you think this is a valid technology or not. So the most basic one would be for testimony, right? So if you put somebody on trial, or if you put a witness, how accurate are they? So this is a question of memory. So we know a lot about memory. Perhaps we can understand a little bit about this. The second one is this idea whether we can believe people. So this is more of a question of, Do we have the technology to tell if somebody's lying or not? And then we'll take a little bit of a transient and we'll talk about consciousness. And this is an interesting one, which is the idea of whether we can tell if somebody should be on life support or should they not be on life support. Can we use this neuroscience technology to understand that? And then we'll close out with the idea of understanding culpability. So can we, just like in the first slide, can we talk about the fact that there was a disability or there was a brain abnormality? Does that excuse the behavior that we're observing? Okay, so let's talk about the idea of lie detection and familiarity and memory in general, right? So if we're thinking about understanding familiarity, we want to understand that the neurosignature of something that's familiar is going to be different than something that's unfamiliar, right? So if you are putting somebody in the scanner, you could technically say, well, we're going to show you a picture of the crime scene, and that should activate parts of your brain involved in memory, and that should be the same or different, should be the same as the one that you saw, but should be different than the one that you didn't see, right? So this is a question of memory. Now, the other aspect of this is if we want to detect deception, we can ask the simple question: the neurosignature of lying is going to be different than the one that's of truth. And this is what you see in a lot of TV shows with physiological measures where people are hooked up to a lie detector test, right? And we'll get into that, but that's basically a skin conductance response. They're just basically seeing how well your sympathetic nervous system responds to things that make you uncomfortable. So this is a question of conflict. Are you conflicted about something that you might be true or might not be true? So one of the things that I thought would be useful to look into is this idea of neuromechanisms of memory and conflict. And are they different when things are high, when the stakes are high? Because if something is emotional, then that's what's happening in a scene that might be recounted in court, or that it might be something that we are in conflict about, okay? So when we think about memory and emotion, we often think about areas such as the hippocampus that's involved in memory, and we don't often think about the amygdala, but the amygdala is also involved in memory. And the way it is because the amygdala is an area that's important for emotion. Essentially, you might have something like an experience. So let's say something that's kind of emotional happen, leads to emotional arousal. So like it's exciting or intense, that's coded by the amygdala. And then the amygdala is going to tell the brain to store that, right? So it's not that the amygdala itself is causing the memory, but it's like tuning it to say like that memory has a lot of emotional content. So it's making it more memorable in the sense of making it more emotional. Okay, so let me do a quick test with you guys now, which is that I'm going to show you a picture, and I want to see if you remember anything from the picture. Okay, so and I'm going to show it pretty fast. Okay, so this requires some participation. Did you guys see anything in the picture that I flashed really quickly? Anything stood out? Don't be shy. All right. So if I ask you what
I saw a knife.
all right, there was definitely a knife, right? And that's the first thing that people remember is the knife. Because the knife is the really salient thing, is the event, is the thing that's going to draw your attention to. And that's what's going to make your amygdala kind of light up and say, whoa, there's something that there's potentially threatening, right? So what the arousal is going to do, and that's going to be intense, it's going to focus your attention right to this area here where the knife is, okay? And it's kind of blurring all the other details around the knife, okay? So why that's interesting is because it leads people to think that they very confidently saw what they saw, which is the knife. And they'll be very good about the details around this area, but they're going to blur the details around the rest of the picture, okay? But just because they don't remember stuff or accurately remember stuff from the periphery, it doesn't mean that they don't think they do. So that's what the conflict is that you're going to have memory that you think is going to be very strong, but it may not be accurate, Okay, so here's one interesting study that shows that when people see like an emotional film, you get more activity in the amygdala, recalling those emotional items. But when you see a neutral film, like a boring kind of discussion or something, then you don't see any amygdala activity and it doesn't show any boost in the memory. So here is a picture of the Challenger explosion, which you may not remember, but this was a big event for many people. I remember when I was a kid and I watched this, and I remember I can tell you vividly what was happening, but I can also tell you that I'm probably wrong in my memory, okay? So when the Challenger happened, Neisser and Harsh did a study when they had 106 students recall the disaster the morning after it occurred, okay? And they gave all the details. What do you remember? What were you doing? What was your emotion at the time? So on and so forth. And then they asked them to recall it again 2.5 years later. And what the results showed is that everybody was super confident in the memories. I remember like it was yesterday kind of thing. But that the accuracy was very low. That is, it didn't really match what they said 2.5 years ago. And even if the experimenters gave them some cues to remember, it didn't really improve it. So that presents a pretty interesting thing, right? Because when we think about emotional memories and eyewitnesses' memories, people are very confident, like, no, I remember that's what they were wearing, that's what they were doing. And one can be very confident and sound very confident, but that doesn't mean that you're always accurate. Okay, so the moral of the story here is that sometimes we have vividness, high confidence, but poor accuracy. Arousal tends to make these central details important, but ignores the peripheral details, okay? And the amygdala is key during arousing situations that can contribute to the consolidation of these memories. All right, so that's the question that we're left with. Does that make somebody a reliable witness? And remember, some of these trials sometimes can be like a year or two after the event actually happened. All right, so with this idea of the neurosignature familiar scenes or people be different than unfamiliar scenes of people, this question of memory, we are left with some questions. Okay, so now I want to do another little activity with you guys. And for this, I'm going to try to get some participation this time. All right, this is fun. So, as fun as remembering words can be. Okay, so I'm going to show you a list of words. Okay, and then afterwards, I'm going to ask, I just want you to read the words and try to remember them. Got it? Okay, I'm going to assume you got it. Here we go. All right, everybody got the words? Can't write it down. Okay, so now when we talk about straight up memory, if I just ask you for remember a list of words, now we're talking about the hippocampus, right? So here's the hippocampus, it's shaped like a seahorse. You can see it in that picture of the brain, part of the medial temporal lobe. If we were to test your long-term memory, and I should ask you in the next day or two to remember how many words do you remember from that list, right? You would show, if you consolidated well, you'd show some good memory, and you'd get better over time. But if somebody who has amnesia, no hippocampus, they basically can remember the first word or two, but they'd be pretty bad afterwards, okay? Because they can't consolidate that memory into long-term memory. So what actually happens, short-term memory, somebody who has amnesia, somebody who doesn't have a hippocampus, is fine. The reason is because we depend more on our prefrontal cortex for that short-term working memory. Okay, so you can see a control and amnesic would show the same short-term memory, but the next day, after consolidation, then you can see the long-term memory only stays with the control, not the amnesic. And this is because the hippocampus is very important in making memories. Now, we don't have the time to do the test tomorrow, so I'm going to do the test with you today. So I'm going to show you the words again, and I'm going to ask you if you remember. So when I do this in a lecture or a class, I ask people to kind of clap when they remember the following words. You guys are all on mute and off camera, but maybe you can humor me and try it anyway, okay?
Let's try, guys. Come on. Turn off at least the microphone.
Yeah, or either microphone or camera just to try to clap when you see the word that you recognize.
Please. Let's
All right.
see. Hold on. Let me see. I still have everybody muted. There's one coming out. Okay, now we're going to clap, right?
All right, let's try.
Let's try. Let's try. Oh, it started already. Hold on.
Started one.
Okay, go.
If you guys remember that, you clap. Okay.
Cool.
All right. So I heard some clapping, so that was good. So now let me ask you verbally. You guys said yes to candy. Is that right?
Yes.
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 Fish was a no.
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 Really?
Art, yes.
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 Thread,
No.
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 two.
No.
No.
Okay. Some mixture in tooth. Pie,
Yes.
No.
Yes.
No.
well, mix. Needle,
No.
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 sweet.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So everybody had, I think, at least candy, heart, and sweet. And here's the actual list that we used.
Wasn't there cake? Oh yeah, there was cake.
There was cake,
I knew
but
there
there's
was
no
cake.
sweet. And everybody said sweet was there. Why is that?
Is that because there's a lot of sweet things in the
Because
list?
there's a lot of sweet things. So your brain decided that sweet's related. So it's probably in there, right?
Right.
But that's not true. So this is just a silly example. But you can imagine that we do this all the time, which is create sometimes what's known as a false memory. We think for sure that something is there, but it's not. But look at your hippocampus when this happens. Okay. So if you see here, the red line is a word like candy that was there. So that's true. The orange line is when it's false, which is sweet. It looks exactly the same, right? So your hippocampus is not telling the difference between what you think was true and what you think was false. That is, I'm sorry, what you think is true and what wasn't true, but you think it is. So that is, the hippocampus is learning it the same way and is encoding it that way. So you're going to remember it long term. Okay. So of course, this has a lot of implications because we can't look into the brain and put somebody in the scanner and say, well, if we just look at the hippocampus, we're going to know if they are remembering it correctly or not, because we can't. The hippocampus is going to show the same signal. Because if you think it's true, then your brain makes it true. And this idea of false memory is a recollection that's fabricated, even though it may feel real in your mind. Okay. And it can be something like silly, like did you turn the lights off or not, or to more serious, right? Believe that you saw somebody somewhere, or that somebody said something and you constructed it in a way that just becomes real in your memory. It's not a memory error. It's not an error in your memory. It's a false memory because it involves, again, confidence that you are correct, right? And it's a recollection of something that didn't happen. I'll tell you a silly story is that I was once having dinner with my parents, and I remember telling them, when you talking to your family, sometimes you go like this, hey, remember that time we did this and that? And then I started telling them, remember the time that I was in the beach and I fell in that hole and you guys had to come get me? And my parents started looking at me like I was crazy. And for real, for 20 years, I had thought that this was a real memory, but it wasn't. I was convinced that this was real, but this is probably something I dreamed. What really happened is that my brother did fall in a little ditch in the beach, and I was young, and that must have made an impression on me. And then I dreamt that it happened to me. It was much more complicated. So our memory can play tricks on us, right? And this is something that Elizabeth Loftus in the University of Washington has done a lot of research on, because she argues that eyewitness testimony can be tampered with. That is, if a lawyer is telling you all this stuff beforehand, and it sounds good, you're like, yeah, I think I remember that. I remember that. Now you made it into your own memory when it's not always true. So conclusions that we have from the idea of memory being something that we can easily measure for the court of law, I think you'll agree with me that it's hard, right? That the brain's memory circuitry may not differentiate actual from imagined, from rehearsed or plausible events. And that, more importantly, also emotion, or the arousal from high emotional situations, can enhance the vividness of what we remember, but not the accuracy of that memory. So it's really hard to say for sure that if we are doing if we're a witness, or if we're trying to accurately remember something, that it's going to be correct all the time, and that we can use neuroscience technology, more importantly, to say for sure that that's the case. Okay. Before I move on to deception, any questions on the memory? All right.
So I have a question then. So how can I guess the people that, the way you question people, the way you, in these scenarios of law, try to incorporate this situation? How can you validate that people are creating these false memories, but they believe to a T that is true? And then they go into the court of law, and then they give them a validity of that, and that is not, that is false. How is if the court system is taking into account this data, or is it not?
Mm-hmm. So it's a great question. I think it does, but it does it the different way, which is that memory is liable, right? Memory is something that's often changing. And I have no doubt that somebody may have the events correct, or have the memory of an event. It's just that little details become harder to really believe, and also can be manipulated, maybe is the word, from just over rehearsal. Maybe a lawyer is just, or interrogations, they're just keeping asking questions and asking questions and asking questions, and eventually you kind of keep constructing or reshaping that memory. So it might never be exactly how it really was, and that's the issue, right? But it's the best that we have, eyewitness accounts, compared to not having it. But the best thing that the law tries to do, I guess, is to have corroborating accounts. Just like in science, you don't want to just have one measure, you want to have multiple measures showing the same thing. For the law, you want to have a witness account, but a video as well, and some other memories, everything that kind of adds together to create a better case. But if you're just relying on one single eyewitness for the whole case, then I would think that a good defense lawyer might say, well, but there's these issues of false memories, and this is a problem. How can we really question we're not quite sure if the witness is accurate or not. Right.
And so, but now with the use of videos for everything, I guess is that admissible? These videos are admissible now to refresh memories and stuff like that?
I think so, because everybody has a phone these days. So almost everything, there's like cameras all over the place. So it's much, in a way, it's better than relying on people's memory of what happened, right? Well, here's actual video evidence of what happened.
Exactly. Okay, thank you.
All right, so the other question that we were going to talk about is this idea of deception, because what people had been really interested in is, can neuroscience let us know if somebody's lying or not, right? And of course, the basis of this is a police station, there is polygraph tests. Like I said, all that is a skin conductance test. You basically put somebody, you hook somebody up to a machine that measures essentially how much you're sweating. That sweating is a measure of your sympathetic response. So they ask you questions that are maybe calm, that you should have no emotional intensity to, like what's the weather and where do you live and things like that, where your baseline should be kind of flat. And then they'll ask you something emotional that you should react to, right? Where were you the night of the crime? And you might get startled, and then you might get a response. So while that's a nice measure, it can't be full measure, because you can get startled by many things. You can get startled by somebody just saying a question that bothers you, or saying it in a certain way, and that can lead to a sympathetic response. So that's why it's not a reliable test. But I once had a colleague who said that you could do transcranial magnetic stimulation. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but that induces temporary lesions in parts of the brain. And this person was arguing that, hey, if you can have that technology, you could actually just do a temporary lesion in this area of the brain called the cingulate, which is right in the middle here, right in the frontal cortex. And if you do that, then people can't lie. Okay, so many problems with that, right? So the first one is assuming that a single brain area is dependent on a whole process. B, assuming that if you do that, then that's also going to cause somebody to do that. And then third, there's a other aspect of over-interpreting data, and the technology is not quite, if you do something like that, the technology is going to affect other parts of the brain too. So let me give you a different kind of experiment to show you what I'm talking about. So you guys have heard of the Stroop task? The Stroop task is a simple task where you have to basically, you're asked to tell me what color you see in the screen, right? If I ask you what color that is, I'm sure you could say it's green. But you also notice that it's spelled out as green, right? So it's easier if I ask you what color is it, because your eyes immediately read green. If I ask you now what color is on the screen and you want to say purple, you still say purple, but it might take you slightly longer just because your eyes initially read green. Does that make sense?
Wait, so you want us to tell you the name we see or the color we see?
The color.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, because that, so if I ask you the color here, you're gonna say green really fast. If I ask you the color here, you're gonna say purple a little slower. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because you immediately read green, because that's the easiest thing to do. So that's called the Stroop task, because what's happening is when you get to this part here, you experience conflict. You experience a little conflict because there's two potential options and your brain's deciding which one is the right one. Okay, so if I showed you a bunch of these, you could probably do it pretty quickly, but it might take you a second or two. Okay, so let me try. Well, I won't ask you to do it because we're on Zoom. But if we were to do it in class, for example, you might try it and then you notice that it's a little slower. Okay, so when people do this kind of task, you get a lot of singular activity because you're experiencing conflict. That's why that person told me that, hey, maybe we can just take that area out and then you have no conflict and you just tell the truth. Okay, but now let me show you the problem with the issue, or the problem with what he was saying. Okay, so let's do a different type of Stroop task. Okay, so you don't have to unmute yourself. You can just try to name that color, and then I'm going to ask you later about it. Okay, so name the color.
Yellow, white, purple, green, orange.
Orange.
Right. Not too hard, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so now let's do it again and try to name the color. Okay, ready?
Ooh, go. Red, yellow,
Yellow,
green,
green,
purple,
purple, white, orange.
Was that harder? Slightly harder?
No.
Yeah, for some people said no, some people said yes. But here's the interesting thing is that the words are obviously more emotional. So maybe cause you to pause a little bit, right? And when you do the two types of Stroop task, and I just changed the emotional content of it, look what happens to the brain activity. It changes from one to more interior, right? So there is changes in the brain as soon as the content or the meaning of the kind of words change. Maybe they have significance to certain people, whatever may it be. The point is, it's never one little area of the brain. It can move around depending on the context, depending on the situations, depending on the person. So to argue that you can just pinpoint one particular person to say, or one particular brain area to say, this is what's involved in conflict, it's a hard sell. It's a difficult one. And then to attribute that to say, wow, if we measure this one area and they have conflict, that means that they're lying. That's also a hard sell. Okay. So the idea of neuromechanisms of conflict and interference can shift as soon as the events become more emotionally salient, because it adds other brain areas kind of feeding into it, and it might change the significance of it, and it might change the location of it. So the fact that emotion can significantly change location and connectivity of brain areas in this context suggests that we can't just think of one technology in one brain area for one particular event. And there's consequences of trying to use these techniques for this kind of thing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, I see a question in the chat maybe. Oh, okay. It's a comment. Okay, so I see a question in the, I'm going to show you now an example where this was actually used improperly. Okay, so this is a story of Aditi Sharma. She was in India, and she was accused of murdering her husband through poison. And they gave her this, it's not an MRI, but it's something called a BEOS, a brain electrical oscillation signature test, kind of like an EEG. And they said that this is kind of like a lie detection test. And it's supposed to be able to identify whether an individual possesses memories related to a specific event. And so they gave her this. They said that this was proof of her guilt, and they sentenced her for a crime. Now, can you imagine some technology that we just discussed that is unproven based on hypotheses that we just suggested are very problematic, and to be convicted of a crime because of this? This raises a lot of ethical concerns. Wouldn't you agree? So this led to so many issues that in 2008, Nature Neuroscience, which you all know is a premier journal in neuroscience, had an editorial called Deceiving the Law. And it said, lie detection tests have not been scientifically proven to reliably detect deception at an individual level. Yet they're being marketed by several companies and have even been admitted as evidence in an Indian court. This called for a critical appraisal of these technologies and regulatory measures to prevent misuse. At the time, there was a company, I think it was in Atlanta, that was called No Lie fMRI, which suggested that they can put people in the MRI and tell the purchaser, you know, when whether that person is lying or not. So I believe that company does no longer exist, but it was a big issue about misusing the technology for things that that obviously the science does not support. Okay, so before I go on to the next topic, any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So in this, like the MRIs and the scans that they would want to do to prove someone is like recalling an event, for example, like a murder, if they do so by, like, for example, showing a picture of the crime scene, couldn't that like trigger memories of, like, for example, movies or like a TV show where they saw something similar as well?
Exactly. So that's the problem, right? Is like maybe that person even saw that place or it's similar enough. So anytime we see something like the word sweet, right, that you guys didn't think was, that you guys thought it was there, it's just related to the words. So your brain is wired to see a stimulus, and it tries to connect up with what does that stimulus relate to in your brain? To what experiences? To which people? To whatever, right? Even if you see just if you go home to your grandma's home, for example, and you smell the apple pie, right? It's just a simple smell, but then it brings back all these memories. So everything can trigger an array of memories that maybe has nothing to do with what you're doing or seeing right now. But that's the problem of trying to say for sure that somebody's lying, or that memory is real, or they definitely have some recognition of that. Because we just can't support that. So great question. Kayla.
Yeah, I had a question about this because actually it was I think not this last school year, but the previous spring, I had done like a report in one of my classes with a group of people about fMRI lie detection and some of the arguments as to why it could or couldn't work. And in our project, we sort of touched a little bit on how people were trying to do sort of a research, trying to kind of better understand the sort of a neural signature, I suppose, of truth telling versus lie telling and these things in different contexts. And I want to know if you knew anything more about that research and like sort of like its robustness or, you know, to this concept.
Yeah, so good question. So there was a period of time where a lot of people were looking at this idea of deception, and can you find the neural correlates of deception, right? And they did convey that the singlet that the area of the brain that we just discussed, is involved. But the reason it's involved is because it's involved in when there's conflict, right? So when we're thinking like, is this right? Is this wrong? But it's been really hard to specifically say that's a signature of lying, because we experience conflict for anything. You can get that singular activity for conflict, like should I get coffee or tea? Should I get this or that? Or do I, any little decision, anything that you're thinking of. And that doesn't necessarily mean you're lying, right? Even if you're getting asked a question, you might get single activity because you're trying to interpret the question. Is that person trying to ask me this way or that way, right? And what my fear has always been misinterpretation of the data, because also you can get activity in certain brain areas for different reasons, but it may be associated with the reason that, or what we're studying. So that's why you need multiple studies, multiple control conditions, and different measures to try to get at that. Do I think that it's possible that you can get some kind of measure about the person's moral inclinations with brain measures? Yes. Do I think it's the only measure and the ultimate measure that you should rely on? No. So I don't have much on this here, but I'm happy to talk about it. There's a lot of research on moral decision making as well. There's this researcher from New Mexico, Ken Keel, who actually takes an MRI scanner in a truck to prison, which is pretty interesting. And what he does is he's able to scan people who are in jail, and he shows them moral dilemmas, like burning car fire, right? And he asks, is this morally good, morally bad? And then he just kind of gets these measurements of them. And what he finds is the people who have conflict deciding whether these moral things are good or bad, the more conflict you have when you really should say it's bad right away, the more activity in the singlet you get, and that predicts whether that person is going to basically commit a crime again in the future or not, which is interesting, but again, can't be the only measure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I learned a lot of new information. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. So I've been kind of down on the idea of using technology for the law. I wanted to try to echo that it's just that I don't think we're there yet for the science, and I don't think that we are, we can't use it as the only thing. I fear juries, judges, and whoever's in the courtroom getting swayed by a very pretty brain picture and thinking, oh, there's a picture in the brain and therefore that's it. And that shouldn't be the case, right? It should be an overwhelming abundance of evidence where science can be one of them. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit though, and I'm going to show you an example of something that I feel like where the neuroscience actually can be helpful if done appropriately. Okay. I don't know if you guys remember, this is a while ago, a case of Terri Schiavo. She was a person who had a coma due to cardiac arrest in the 1990s. And after that, she was diagnosed to be in what's known as a persistent vegetative state. Okay, the persistent vegetative state is kind of like a coma, right? The person doesn't really wake up, except that they are not completely out like a coma that you see in a movie. They can make noises, they can even show some smiles and such. They seem like they're reacting. It's just, but they are in this persistent vegetative state where they are not really interacting that much, and they're not talking, and they're not responding. Okay, so she did a couple of years of therapy, and then the husband and legal guardian decided that they wanted to remove the feeding tube because after several years there was no progress. The parents fought this for a long time. It was in court for a really long time because the parents said, no, she's still responding to us, she's still smiling to us, she's there still, she's still there. And it took until 2005 when the husband finally won the legal case and her feeding tube was removed. Okay, so this is an interesting question, and it's a difficult one because it's a question of whether we can tell with these brain technologies whether somebody is actually responsive or not, whether somebody is there or not, or if it's just a consequence of their state. So like I said, the persistent vegetative state Patients, they open their eyes, they breathe on their own, they make sound, they have facial expressions, but the question is, are they conscious? So Owen in 2006 did what I think was like one of the most impressive studies I've ever seen, where he actually took a patient and he taught the patient to do a task where he said, I want you to imagine you're moving, like you're playing tennis, okay? Or I want you to imagine you're walking around your house, okay? So these are two kind of things. The first one is kind of like motor imagination, okay? So that's going to activate from non-coma studies, people knew that this was going to activate areas of the brain like the supplementary motor area, okay? Because you're imagining making a motor plan of what you're doing, how you should be moving around your arms, how you should be playing tennis. Now, the other aspect of it in spatial navigation, you kind of have to have a map of what your house is like, and you got to walk around and such. So that's going to be more parietal kind of cortex. Okay. So Owen knew that if he did this, this could be something that a patient who's conscious could be able to respond to. So on the top here, I'm going to show you a picture of a patient, and on the bottom is a control patient. Okay. Notice how when Owen asked them to think about playing tennis, look at the activity. It's very similar, right? So in the SMA. And notice then when Owen asked them to think about walking around inside their home, again, very similar activity, a lot of parietal cortex. Now, that's really interesting because that means that the patient is A, understanding the instructions, and B, consciously doing what they're asked to do, which is imagine one scenario versus imagining the other scenario. So what do you think about this one? Because I'm about to show you why it gets even more interesting. Because what Owen did then is decided, well, if the patients can do this, I wonder if I can ask them to answer questions using this technique. So he started asking them questions like, is your father named Alexander? If yes, think about playing tennis, right? If your father's named Thomas, if no, think about walking around your home. So you could actually show the yes and the no based on that. And the patient actually was responding correctly. So this would suggest that this patient at least was conscious. Okay. Now, one other quick thing to say is the implication here for us is, A, this is really interesting to see, but can you use this method to ask patients difficult questions about courses of treatment? What do you guys think?
Well, it's a very
It's a heavy question.
yes. I mean that we discussed that in the group the other day about consciousness and how, how can we make sure that people in persistent vegetative states are conscious or not, or they can make decisions on their own about, like you just said, your treatment. So please stop feeding me. I don't want to live this way. I mean, would that fly? If we do an MRI and ask them, okay, do you want to continue this way? And they will say no. And then something will light up. What would be, again, the validity from the medical standpoint? Would that allow the families to bring a legal case for it to stop, giving, if the person depends on life support or whatever like that? I don't know how we achieve that, or I don't know.
Can I potentially respond to that?
Please.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think this evidence is really compelling just for the purpose of, being able to communicate with them on like a basal level, but for trying to determine like, can they make decisions on their own? Maybe a comparable case being like maybe an older adult who is now developing dementia, and clearly like their mind is going on a course where they need extra support. And in those cases, a lot of times they become, dependent on someone. And, I think how they determine that is like a battery of some sort, or they can get some sort of assessment. I don't know if they're filling out questions or if there's some sort of an examination to determine something like that. And I wonder if that could be developed in this case, and, how simple or complex it would need to be to sort of feel out everything you would need to determine, okay, this person can decide for themselves how they want the course of their treatment to go.
Yeah, I mean, I put the question up there just for discussion, right? I think it's incredibly difficult. I love this idea, what Owen here did and Monty here did in terms of doing these studies, because I think it opens up a lot of doors. But these are very simple questions. Is your father's name Alexander? Maybe you can ask them, can I close the window in your room, kind of things. But the implications of a different kind of course of treatment is very difficult. I would only think that maybe a family would want to know something, but it's really hard to say. Look, if you look at the patient's brains, you can see how heavily impacted the brain is, right? There's a lot of space in the ventricles there, a lot of mass missing in the brain. But I think that the idea what this technology is really doing here and what's really helping is at least answering the question of whether the person is conscious or not. And I think that we can kind of say with some certainty, based on these results, that this particular patient at least certainly seems conscious.
But that's really scary as well, because, it's like a person is trapped in a body that they cannot react upon their life.
Yeah, and you really can't keep just putting everybody in the scanner all the time to ask them questions, right? It's not like a simple, quick thing either. If they could develop something where they could maybe more easily answer kind of questions, maybe the quality of life would improve a little bit. All right, so now my final topic is the idea of thinking about culpability. When can we say somebody is culpable of a crime, or say they're not culpable of a crime because of their age, because of potentially brain disability that they may have? And this is a very difficult discussion, an interesting discussion at the same time, because there are certainly cases of people who may be affected by this, but don't always get the benefit of that doubt yet. And then there are cases where people kind of maybe abuse this when it shouldn't be the case, right? So the question becomes, can knowledge about someone's neural underpinnings be used as a defense for breaking the law? And I'm going to start with the idea of adolescence, because adolescence, as we know, is a time for growth and maturation in the brain, and a time when many new behaviors begin to emerge, many of them more risk-taking behaviors, right? There's changes in attention, changes in motivation, changes in risk-taking. And the reason is because the brain is not fully developed until early adulthood. So we can see here a picture of the dorsal part of the brain, looking at maturation of the cortical pathways. And you can see that as we progress and get older, that's when you see more maturation in those prefrontal cortical, in the cortical regions, right? Which, of course, more cortical maturation, better executive function, and as well as better cognitive control. So better control of our ideas. Do you guys know the marshmallow test? You ever heard of the marshmallow test? Okay,
Yeah.
let me tell you. Okay, so I'll tell you for those of you that don't know. I had a little video for you, but I'll just show it. I'll just tell you about it. It's basically a test where you can get a kid, let's say a 4 or 5 year old kid. You give them one marshmallow and you say, okay, here's one marshmallow. If you wait until I come back, you can have 2 marshmallows. Okay, so it's kind of a test of impulsivity, right? And you try to see how much the kid can wait to eat the marshmallow. And you wait and wait and wait until they either eat it or give up. Now, it turns out that most of the kids can wait. They wait for the second one. By the way, as soon as they get the second one, they eat both of them right away, but at least they waited, right? But some kids don't. And the argument here is the kids that don't, they don't have as much cognitive control. And one of the predictors that allows you to tell you that that person's going to hold out for the second marshmallow is their age. So 5-year-olds are more likely than 4-year-olds to wait for that second marshmallow because they have a little bit more cognitive control, right? Okay, so this leads to many ideas in terms of, here, this is called the triadic model. If you look here, the adult, you have a prefrontal cortex that's essentially in perfect balance and is controlling your reward systems or your striatum systems, which are involved in impulsivity, right? You want a reward now, versus the more avoidance amygdala, so the amygdala is all in balance as well. But the problem is during adolescence, in a positive context, let's focus just on the positive context. The prefrontal cortex is not developed yet, so you kind of want the now more. So that is, if you're faced with a reward, like I want the marshmallow now, or can I wait for 2 marshmallows later? Okay, we tend to say like, no, I'll think about my reward for later. I can wait. But if you don't have the cognitive control, you're going to be more impulsive. Okay, you're going to have more striatum activity that's going to win over the prefrontal cortex. Does that make sense? Let me give you a different example. This is a study by Larry Steinberg. He has these studies in a driving simulator. So in the driving simulator, they participants are driving, okay, and their task is to get a monetary reward. They have to get to the end of the task in as little time as possible. But every now and then they'll hit a yellow light. And then if they rush through the yellow light, maybe they make it. But if they don't make it, they kind of crash in the simulator. Is like a time penalty. Okay. So safer to stop and wait than to try to risk it. You can take some risks sometimes, but not all the time. The question that Larry Steinberg asks is, how do adolescents perform in this task? Adolescents who just kind of got their license. And also, how do they perform when their friends are in the simulator with them? Okay, because as we know, this idea of social context and being around others is a really powerful reward and something that can change how we feel and what we do. So here's the data. Okay, so most people take about 50% risks in the yellow lights, which makes sense. This is what usually people do. And I want you to see the adolescents in particular, right? They kind of look like the young adults and the adults. But when there's somebody in the car, look at the amount of risks. They go way up, right? So it's something about having in that environment with your friends that makes you even more willing to take risks, okay? And this has been shown that whenever the friends are with the around and you feel like you're in a positive social context, you get more of this reward system that tends to facilitate these risky decisions. So we go back to our argument that the prefrontal cortex is now not developed and you can't shut this down. That's going to make you make the wrong decisions. So a lot of times, before I get to psychopaths, so a lot of times I'm missing a slide here, but the slide that I wanted to show you is that one of the arguments that has been made is this lack of prefrontal cortex can cause a lot of this poor decision making. So a lot of cognitive neuroscientists have argued in front of the courts that adolescents and children cannot be sentenced to life for crimes that they have committed because their prefrontal cortex is not developed. So this has actually another example where neuroscience was integral in changing the law, right? So they have parole because even if they commit like a violent crime, because of this idea that at this age they don't have the necessary cognitive abilities to completely inhibit their behaviors. So
that will go against anything that says that you try a child as an adult. And they do that in certain states.
They do.
I mean, 10-year-olds 11-year-olds trialed as an adult is against all science.
So
But
they can, so unfortunately they get tried as an adult, but they can't be sent. So the best thing that came out of that was that they can't be sentenced to life in prison like an adult could. So
but that's still
it's still a problem.
yes.
It's still a problem. But there was a case in Florida, for example, where the 16-year-old was committed a crime, and there was, I believe, murder involved. And that's the case, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court justice because they got sentenced to life. And then it got changed because of the science to say no, he has a right to parole because he committed this crime when he was an adolescent. But it hasn't completely helped in terms of trying people as adults. I had a discussion with a judge in San Diego once, which is really enlightening because he used to deal with a lot of gang violence in San Diego. And his argument was that he loved the science because he argued all of this, and he never sentenced the adolescents and never tried them as adults. He was used to argue that they needed reform, they needed help early on. And in fact, he had cases of kids that he helped that he noticed later on in life were doing okay. You just had to take him out of that context, take him out of the social context that caused them to do this. And they could do more prefrontal cortex control and do better decisions. It's just that we don't have as many judges that always think like that, unfortunately. But yeah, so but there is a law that says that adolescents cannot be sentenced to life in prison because of the prefrontal cortex argument. All right, so my last topic here is we talked about this idea of brain development, but there's also brain abnormalities, right? And often we argue that there are people who are committing these crimes, adults, who we wonder why are they committing these crimes. And this is the focus on poor behavior and on the prefrontal cortex, and specifically on the role of the orbitofrontal cortex, which, as you might remember, a story from Phineas Gage, when Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who had a rod kind of go through his left frontal lobe, and specifically the orbitofrontal cortex. And after that, he became what his friends described as no longer Gage, no longer the same person. He was uninhibited, antisocial, and did a lot of very poor behaviors. Okay, so one of the issues of the orbitofrontal cortex is heavily connected to the amygdala. So if you're disrupting the orbitofrontal cortex, you're disrupting those connections to the amygdala, and you're basically having a peculiar kind of response. You might think it's like just a really strong emotional response, but it's quite the opposite, right? It's a lack of emotional response. It's a lack of emotional understanding. So a lot of psychopaths would show lack of empathy towards the victims, right? So if you are, for example, to give one of those skin conductance response tests that we talked about, that measures your arousal response to something. So here's an example where you see here, galvanic skin responses, E is an emotional picture, N is a neutral picture, right? So for neutral picture, for red is control patient, and when you see something with blood or something morally bad, you would see an emotional response. Nothing for the neutral, but then again for the emotional response. A patient that has orbitofrontal cortex damage is going to show a flat response. That is, they can tell you something's wrong with a picture, but they're not showing you an emotional response. So what's the problem not showing an emotional response? You don't show empathy-like responses to situations that normally people will be like, I can't hurt you, I can't do this, because you're feeling that emotional response. You feel what the other person feels, right? And if you don't have that, then you might have these psychopathic tendencies, right? So this is James Fallon from UC Irvine, and that's his mom. It's a nice picture of his mom. And he had a hypothesis that the OFC had to be like a marker for this. And so he had such a strong belief in this that we went over brain after brain after brain, looking for, I believe, changes in the volume of the OFC. And he said, I can show that if there's this abnormality in the OFC, that's going to be linked to psychopathy traits. And he did this for a while, right? So he said people with low activity in the orbitofrontal cortex are either freewheeling types or sociopaths. And then he found out that his brain was kind of different than the control brain, and that he fit the profile that he was talking about. And then that's why his mom is in the picture, because he called his mom to figure out, like, did I ever show any psychopathic tendencies as a kid? Turns out that he didn't. And he was fine. But there was a family history, somebody way, way, way removed. So maybe it was in the genes, who knows? But the point I'm making here is actually a different one, is that we can have ideas about brain areas that are going to be involved in the process, but to call it a biomarker, sometimes one has to be careful, because we can have certain aspects of our brain that are going to respond a certain way, but the environment also has a lot to do with causing somebody to perform behaviors that way. Okay. All right. So yeah, that's the implication. Neuromarker is not everything. The environment plays a critical role. I want to end with one more, because I want to tell you a little bit about the opposite of the psychopath in this different way, right? Because if we talk about the psychopath being somebody who doesn't have that strong emotional response, what happens with somebody who has a really strong emotional response? Do we have the alternative to it? Okay, so this gets into the question of altruism, which is defined as the belief in the practice of disinterested and selfless concern for the well-being of others. Okay, so we know that, for example, evolutionarily, if we think about chimpanzees, they can't swim. They have even drowned in zoo modes trying to save others. They'll starve themselves for several days instead of getting food, just because it might actually shock somebody else. So evolutionary altruism is really strong. Which gets back to the idea of morality, right? But here's what I wanted to tell you about is Angela here. So Angela, this is studied by Abigail Marsh. Angela is somebody who is what we say a super altruist. She's somebody who's an anonymous kidney donor. Okay, she saw a family and a woman in the TV who was needing a kidney. She felt bad. She felt empathy. She felt very strong empathy. And so the next day she went over to the hospital and she donated the kidney. No, she was completely anonymous, except for this, of course, we know about her, but she was anonymous to the person and everything else. And it raised the question of what makes somebody want to do this, right? It's not like it was a family member or somebody she knew. And she said, she just felt a strong need to help others at that time, right? And I mean, she's somebody who was alone, and that she felt that she had this need. And what we see with these altruists is actually a really strong emotional response, a really strong amygdala kind of response and empathy towards others, which is interesting, because then we have this case where somebody who's really, really emotional and empathic about others, and then we have the case of the psychopaths who show no emotion towards others, right? So it's kind of interesting to see how emotion can play around with our systems and change the way we feel about others and our behaviors. Okay. All right. So we talked a lot about this idea of using neuroscience techniques in the applications to the law. I think we saw limitations in some of the bigger picture things, such as lie detection and understanding the accuracy of testimony. We saw that it can be helpful for understanding life support questions, maybe even some questions of culpability, such as thinking about how the prefrontal cortex is important for cognitive control. But there's a lot of questions still to be used. And certainly we have to think about the idea of using these techniques together. And there are other issues that I even get into, such as this idea of pain, and using a neuroscience technique to talk about questions of disability, suffering, or even understanding this idea of cognitive manipulations, such as people sometimes take cognitive enhancers or cognitive blockers, and they can affect jury or eyewitnesses. So these are just some of the questions that kind of exist. And there's potential to using technology. We have technology, we should try to use it, but we have to use it appropriately, responsibly, and in conjunction with many other things to kind of accurately try to assess this. And with that, I'll open up to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mauricio, for that wonderful presentation. Any questions from the chat or comments for closing?
Thank you for the presentation. I have one question. What is happening with psychopath kids? Like they don't have their brain completely developed, but what is maybe happening in those cases?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's really difficult, right? Because, and I'm not an expert on this, but I hate to pigeonhole a kid into that kind of thing, because if they show callous kind of behaviors early on, anger, violence, and you certainly want to see the signs and you want to be able to treat them. I think there needs to be a lot of understanding, a lot of treatment, and observation of the early signs without making the kid feel like that's who they're destined to be, because it doesn't work like that. It doesn't have to be. It's just because you're showing the signs, you can't. The brain is plastic. Your environment can be changed, and you can help shape the brain as you go along. So I think we really need better treatment, better facilities for treatments, and better ways to identify who needs treatment early. It works. Early intervention works for so many other things. I don't see why it couldn't work for something like this.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Think about language. Language is the biggest thing for early intervention. When you catch it early enough, you can get kids with learning disorders or language issues without an issue later on.
Any other comments or questions? Something about this topic about children and adolescents committing antisocial behavior. There's a movie, it's called Sicario. It's a movie, a very violent movie. I think it's the last version, because there were several versions, but the last one talks about how a young man becomes a sicario, a shooter, no? And how he, through the socialization and watching how people kill each other, or this, which it brings upon, what are they, how they are socializing, what are the motivation. Because for me, seeing a person become a violent individual, it's nothing that they are born like this or anything. I mean, I would never say such a thing. And so there's much, like you mentioned, there's so much about what is the environment that this individual is exposed to, what are the references, the empathy, to take the life of another individual and to make that decision in it's an automatic, the image is like they're doing this because someone told them to do this or something like that.
Yeah.
And in a developing brain, of course, the decision making is conflictive in some way, so.
Yeah, and especially in environments where young children are exposed to violence early on. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of data that shows how that can in fact impact their emotional systems. They tend to have sometimes larger amygdala, larger emotional responses to to different things, and then they become kind of like habituated to certain things.
Yes, so it's just and then all that gun violence, there's a lot of youth and male youth, because you don't get to see a lot of female gangs. I mean, maybe a couple, but the majority are males and young. Yeah. And those are the ones that are dying early on. And then that's the other thing is that, sometimes now you see at the educational system, you see a lot of girls and less men and less boys. We should be thinking about why are not boys in the educational system the way girls are. And then the question should be, okay, why are not there? What is happening in our society? And this happens everywhere, but in particular in societies of disadvantages and minoritized, where then the young boy, what is it? What are his choice for development? You know.
And we talked, I showed you that really quick slide about Larry Steinberg's study where we showed that people with, as soon as the friends are around, right, that's the big draw, that's the big motivator, and that's the big social connector that I think especially boys tend to feel that strength or that need to belong. And unfortunately, that need to belong ends up being belonging to the wrong groups. They're going to shape how you act and how you view the world. So it's really a lot about early intervention. Can you expose even kids in minoritized societies that are exposed to violences in different neighborhoods? Can you create the right groups and the right places where the children can turn to when they need something, when they need help, so they don't turn to the wrong reward groups, let's say. Easier said than done, of course, but that's
of course. But it's a very challenging question, what to do as a society, you know, to give choices and not, because we cannot just start from the get-go that everybody's going to be violent and everybody's going to, you know.
I don't believe anybody's violent. I don't believe anybody's born this way. Everybody they can have markers. They can have whatever in their brain, but that doesn't mean you activate. Many people have different markers for potentially to be addicted to something or sick to something or something like this, but it never has to be activated if your environment doesn't allow it. So really a lot of the environment can shape this.
Oh, definitely. Okay, any more comments or questions before Dr. Delgado finishes today? Okay, well, I want to thank Dr. Delgado once again. Thank you, Mauricio, for being here again. And I really, really appreciate your time and with us.
Please.
And I know the students really enjoyed it. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future in some of our series. And this time, I hope you can come to Puerto Rico, Mauricio.
That'll be great.
They'll make something so you can come back.
That'll be great. I just had a conflict of a different conference around the same time. But thank you so much for having me. And it was nice to meet everybody. And enjoy the rest of your summer.
Thank you. Well, have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Hey, thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.